is it afternoon? Sorry. Oh, it is, right. Thank you for all that are present and listening. So just to carry on from my presentation yesterday, which was on regulatory intelligence, I want to present on a few case studies. So these are actual real-life case studies that I have experienced where I have used regulatory intelligence. So that's why it's called the practice of regulatory intelligence. So the agenda, I'll start with a brief introduction, then I will talk about the 3 case studies I have in the slides. That's the 3 case studies, and then I do a final summary. So I'm going to just briefly go through my process of regulatory intelligence. So this is just purely based on my experience and opinions. So we have the regulatory intelligence, and then the well, I wouldn't say it's necessary to carry out all these steps, but depending on what project you're working on, you may need to carry out either all of them or some of them. And so the steps for me are data collection, data analysis, risk assessment, a regulatory strategy, communication and application. So just bearing those in mind. And so, as I said a few seconds ago, as a regulatory affairs professional, you can either execute all or specific steps of the RI process, depending on your role and responsibility. And so, moving on to the 3 case studies, I would like to talk about the 3 case studies where I have actually gathered regulatory intelligence and used some of the steps in that regulatory process. So the first one is Company A wanting to update their pack design and identify that the SPCs, the summary of product characteristics, also need to be updated to align to current guidelines. And the second case study is more about the company changing the manufacture of the drug product as well as the manufacturing method and also reformulating the excipients. And during that particular scenario, the current manufacturer could not meet the company's current demand. And then case study 3, we'll be talking about the change in the legal entity name of the manufacturing sites on a global scale. And so if I start with case study 1, where the company want to update their pack design and identify that the SPCs also need to be updated to align to the current regulations, I will demonstrate where only the following RI segments were executed. So that's data collection, data analysis, regulatory strategy, communication and application. So if I start with the first RI step, data collection, so what did I do in this situation? Basically, I looked at the company, I liaised with the company marketing function to understand exactly what they wanted to do to the current pack design. And also I had to look through the archives of product history for the products that were going to have a new pack design, and then look at the various health authority websites, the MHRA, EU websites, the current regulations and guidelines in order to change the pack design of the products, and also communicate with MHRA assessors to actually understand exactly what the timelines are to make the changes, and to understand what documentation will be required for the submission package. So that was part of the data collection, the steps, the main steps that I carried out. And then for the data analysis, once I collected that data from the various sources on the previous slide, I basically analysed that data. I looked at the current pack design and the proposed pack design, compare them to see what exactly the differences are and whether they will be acceptable in the MHRA's perspective. Then I looked at what impact they would have on the summary of product characteristics. So for example, if we had to update the pack design in terms of how we stay to the active ingredient in line with current regulations, and obviously there'll be an impact on the summary of product characteristics. And then I looked at how many products will need a pack design and how many SPCs will need to be amended, because bearing in mind for this particular case study there were 30 products that were impacted. And also I did identify during the data analysis that a patient information leaflet, a pill, was required for many of the existing products as they did not have one. Okay, so then the next step was putting together a regulatory strategy, and so what I did, I actually prepared an actual report, a regulatory strategy, based on all the data collection from the various sources, the analysis of that data collection. I also looked at the business priority needs, so of the 30 products, which ones were a priority that needed the pack design update, because a lot of the products were actually not marketed, were currently on the markets, they were dormant, as we call in the EU, dormant licenses. And then I looked at exactly what conditions do we need to fulfill to update the SPC for regulatory submission approval, and what procedure type is required to update the artwork design. Because these were only going to be registered in the UK, at the time the MHRA had a number of various different procedures for updating pack design depending on the changes required to the pack design. And also looking at the documentation and fees required for the submission package, bearing in mind this was for a small healthcare company with a very active marketing function, so I had to keep fees at a minimum and look at the most cost-effective way of getting this change approved. And then also looking at timelines for preparing the submission package, the approval timelines, grace periods, which basically, for those who are not familiar with grace period terms, that's basically exhausting the current packaging and then implementing the new packaging. And also then looking at when the company want to basically launch the new pack design. So these are a lot of timelines to consider when I put together the regulatory strategy. I actually was going to show you the actual report, but I'm not quite sure in terms of intellectual property. I don't know, I'm sure I can share that information with you, but basically it was just a regulatory strategy, an actual report with these various categories, and just outlining exactly how we're going to make this change, what the risks are, what the timelines are, what the different options are. So that basically was the strategy. And then if I move on to the next step that I took, so basically I wrote my regulatory strategy report, and then I had to communicate this with the various departments. So I had to communicate it with the senior management team to get their approval for green light, and then with marketing, so they agreed with the timelines, and then supply chain, also with the artwork coordinators, designers who were going to prepare the new pack design, because I had to communicate the regulatory information that was required on the pack design with the artwork coordinators. And then the final step was putting the actual submission application together. So I prepared the proposed artwork, the SPCs, there were internal reviews of all the changes to the documentation. I had to also get internal approval from various functions such as quality function, manufacturing and marketing function. And then finally putting the actual submission package together. I mean, although I've only put the steps here, it's quite a lot of work involved, and thought process putting the whole package together, because of the many changes and wanting to get the approval within the quickest timeline. It was putting together a package, a documentation, an application which basically had no errors and was communicating clearly to the authorities exactly what the company wanted to do. So we were trying to avoid any extra questions from the authority once we submitted the package, the submission package. And then finally it was submitting to the regulatory authority, the MHRA. So basically they were the steps that I took for this first scenario. And just to give you a conclusion, basically what happened, so the updated pack designs and SPCs were approved after a delay of 3 months. And this was due to the MHRA questions and non-acceptance of the initial proposal during the assessment of the submission package. So basically the MHRA rejected the pack design because they said that in other European countries the pack design was actually an offence. I won't tell you what the actual pack design was, but they rejected it initially on that basis. And so basically the next point what I want to highlight is that because risks such as a non-acceptance of the pack design, that could have been controlled by having a preliminary dialogue with the MHRA. So that's basically you know, my thoughts, my opinion. If we had that initial discussion with the MHRA to explain this is what we want to do, this is how we're going to do it, then the MHRA, they would have basically highlighted at that point, hang on a minute, that's not acceptable. So then so that's basically my final point, is that the execution of risk assessment to highlight the risks and control them, it would have most likely reduced the approval timeline. So the point what I'm making is that because during this scenario I did not do a risk assessment, I basically could have avoided a delay of the 3 months, and we could have launched the product within the timelines, the forecasted timelines. So that's the first case study. So then moving on to the second one, which is more of a quality change to the drug product. This involved a number of changes. So one of them was changing the manufacturer of the drug product, the actual manufacturing process and method, and also reformulating the excipient. So it may read that it was it's quite simple, but it's actually quite a complex process, especially because it was a herbal drug product. And also at the same time the company were in a situation where the current manufacturer could not meet the company's current demand, so we were looking at possibly a disruption of the drug products within the supply chain. And so during this case study, what I did do, I looked at basically the data collection, data analysis. I actually did a risk assessment in this case, a regulatory strategy, I communicated, and also the final application. So this case study actually demonstrates where I carried out all the RI steps from slide 3, I showed you earlier. So basically, for this particular case study, my source of the data collection was, again, the company marketing, supply chain and quality function. I had to get enough information from them, sufficient information to understand exactly what changes were required, what the regulatory implication would be. Also looking at the product history as well, because this was a very well-established product that had been registered 30, 40 years ago, and regulations have changed since then. And also the actual product was not maintained over the years in terms of its license was not maintained. And also looking at the MHRA EU website, the current regulations and guidelines for further data. And also speaking with MHRA assessors as well, having that initial communication So in comparison to the case study one, with this particular case study, I actually had a more active dialogue with the MHRA to understand how we could make these changes in the quickest timeline. So moving on to the next slide then. So once I collected all the data, then I basically did another data analysis, and I looked at what the impact would be on the SPC, the packaging. I also looked at availability of documentation that was required for the submission package, such as a valid GMP certificate, QP declaration, stability studies. Because this product was a very old product, a lot of the documentation wasn't readily available. So basically, it was looking at getting those documents within a timely manner. And then once I did the data analysis, I then carried out a risk assessment. So basically, I looked at okay, what data do we already have? What is missing for the submission? I looked at, you know, so in the EU, we have, for variations, we have to basically follow the EU variation guidelines, and there's various variation procedure types, such as type 1A, 1B, type 2, depending on the complexity of your change. So I had to ensure that I had the correct variation code, otherwise that would have resulted in a non-acceptance by the health authority. And also, because there is more than one change for this particular scenario, I looked at, can we group these variations to speed up the approval process, and part of a group variation is that we have to get the MHRA's pre-approval, and that can take up to 2 weeks. So basically, it was just putting together a risk assessment and trying to look at avoiding any potential delays. And then once that pre-approval notification from the MHRA is available, then that needs to be included in the submission package. So that was another criteria. And also looking at the disruption in supply of the drug due to current manufacturer no longer meeting company's current demands. So how was the company going to avoid that, to ensure that there was continuous supply during the assessment of this change? So once I did the risk assessment, then I put together a regulatory strategy. Once again, I prepared a report which included the data collection, the analysis, including the submission procedure type. I also looked at what the business priority needs were at the time. So basically, the company were actually going through the situation, as mentioned earlier, that the current manufacturer would no longer manufacture the product for them, and so it was looking at, you know, the sales of the product. Was this the company's hero product at the time? So things related to that. And then also looking at the conditions we had to fulfill for the actual regulatory submission package and approval, what documentation was required, the fees required as well. As I said earlier, bearing in mind, you know, it's a small healthcare company, and so we had to look at the most cost-effective way of making these changes. And then the timelines for preparing the submission package, getting the approval, and also the grace period for exhausting the existing stock and implementing the new stock. And so once I did that, then I communicated that to basically with the MHRA, having a pre-submission dialogue with the MHRA to avoid any further delays. I also had to communicate with the senior management, the quality manufacturing supply chain, to get their approval, and also once again with artwork coordinators and designers, because the formulation was also being updated. We also had to update the packaging. And so then the final step was actually doing the application, so preparing the proposed artwork, the SPCs, having internal review of the submission regulatory documents, the proposed documents, and then actually preparing the submission package and then submitting that to the regulatory authority. And so basically the conclusion was that although the submission package had a longer than an anticipated approval timeline, the pre-submission dialogue communication and the fact that I did the risk assessment ensured continuation of the drug supply. So basically the company ensured that the product was still out there in the supply chain regardless of the situation the company were facing at the time. So then if I move on to case study 3, which is very brief, this is only one slide. This is just to demonstrate where I only carried out the data collection and analysis because of my role within this project. So the company, they actually were changing the legal entity name of the manufacturing sites on a global scale. Okay, so basically what I had to do in this scenario, I had to execute an actual gap analysis which involved looking at, okay, what data is already available to make this change and what data is missing. And then once I identified that, I then conducted a regulatory survey which was asking a series of questions on what the regulatory implication would be in all the impacted countries. So for example, change the legal entity name of the manufacturing site that is registered in, say for example, Vietnam in this situation. The Vietnam Health Authority do not allow a grace period where you can actually exhaust your existing stock and implement the new stock. So that was a challenge we had to work around. So basically, just to conclude, due to the complexity of this change, executing the above regulatory intelligence steps was imperative prior to proceeding to the next steps of the RI process. So just to explain, basically, doing the data collection and data analysis in this scenario had to be done before any communication and any submissions, application to the health authority. So just to summarise then, I want to point out that the RI should be executed at the early stage to identify and manage any risks. And then you can have a regulatory strategy, but that regulatory strategy, it has to be driven by the implementation of your regulatory intelligence. And so these case studies do demonstrate that RI is an important task to execute when a company is making changes to its medicine, to the medicines, and at the same time ensuring the continuation of supply. And then on a final point, I just wanted to add that I was practicing RI on a daily basis about 10 years ago in my first role, first regulatory affairs role, and also to conclude that RI, it always has been an industry practice, and the way I see it is actually becoming more recognised, acknowledged in its own right, and it's gaining its long-awaited recognition, because I do feel that it can be undervalued, especially in the companies that I have worked for. So I just wanted to highlight that final point. So they're my contact details, and I just want to say thank you very much for listening, for those of you who were listening. Right. Yes. There's no what, sorry? Oh, but then, yes, but if you have worked with the EU variation guidelines, you have to pick the right change code. I don't know if you have worked with the EU variation guidelines, but sometimes if you pick the wrong change code, you can actually cause more problems, because I have worked with companies where the wrong change code has been selected, and that's caused more delay. So you've got to have the right understanding of what change code applies to your product, to your variation. Yes, but then what? But I've not gone into the detail. When you have selected your change code, then you've got to look at, okay, can we fulfill all these conditions? Have we got all these documentation? And if you can't fulfill all the conditions and have all the documentation, then there are ways of working around that, and that's when you have your dialogue with the health authority. Yes, you may say it's already written on a piece of paper in the guidelines of what you need to do, but sometimes when you actually put it into practice, it's not that straightforward.